Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Welcome back once again to Compass Points, the podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, politics, government, events, and anything else that gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com, and I'm joined, as always, by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you, Scott?
I'm doing well. It's nice and autumny.
Mm-hmm. Do you know this week is fall break, or has been fall break for Knox County schools?
It has been fall break, and that means that a lot of people have been out of town, and there's not been a lot of activity in the public realm that we've been on.
Yeah, our local government bodies and so forth tend to not schedule a lot of things during these school breaks, the fall break, the spring break, because they know people are going to be gone and might not even be able to get a quorum.
Yeah.
Fortunately for us, in the absence of that kind of news, we have an upcoming election. So we've been writing a lot about that this week, and we will be talking about it here on the podcast. We also have an interesting interview coming up with Hancen Sale of the Knoxville Area Association of Realtors, talking about some trends in the housing market, especially as we've seen interest rates rising, which is having some impact there.
Yeah.
And before we get to all that, we did have one bit of news that you wrote about this past week, which had to do with the Knoxville-Knox County planning staff. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it actually came up the week before, but was able to get some more information on it because it kind of came out in weird little bits. But what is happening is the Knoxville-Knox County Planning Commission and then the planning staff, they're authorized under state law. They do planning for Knoxville, and unincorporated Knox County Farragut's got its own planning commission. All along, for decades, they have a staff. They go through whenever anybody applies to have something rezoned or a subdivision plan, whatever like that, they go to staff. Staff makes recommendations, which carry a lot of weight, to the planning commission for their votes up or down on this, and then a lot of times these things go on to city council or county commission. But the staff, they're kind of the gateway into the planning process, and
they're trained specialists, basically.
Yes,
being a planner is a thing you go to school for.
Yeah.
You get a master's degree in. These are supposed to be sort of dispassionate experts looking at what the law is, what the applicant wants to do, and whether or not that can be accommodated, basically.
Right. Yeah. These people they're certified. There's it's not just somebody coming in off the street and applying for a job and they get it and they can be a planner. No, it's a highly professional field, and but the whole idea is for them to give kind of the black and white opinion of what needs to be done, and then they let the appointed planning commission and elected city council and county commission vote on the final decision, but they make their professional recommendations. And ever since the planning commission was established and the believe it was the 50s.
1954, I think.
Yeah. It's had one staff, and they've done both the city and county stuff. The city and the county have different zoning codes, so and other regulations. So, but they've done both. And what came out the week before last was that mayors India Kincannon in the city and Glenn Jacobs in the county decided to split the staff. They and not only split it, but take it away from the Planning Commission and put it in their offices. So
we'll have county planners and city planners.
We will have city planners and county planners. There were a couple of things about that are kind of odd. I mean, the reason that they have said they wanted to do that is that's more efficient, because they also have the city and the county have stormwater engineers who are involved in these matters. They have their own building codes enforcement people who are involved in these matters. So it's not it makes sense from that perspective, and especially to the mayors. Some concerns that have been brought up were the idea that there can be political influence. Now that's a little more direct, because the planning commission staff in the planning, in the standalone planning office, is kind of got a buffer between them and the mayors. And
right. They have been working for the director of the planning commission, who's appointed by both mayors, but is kind of it's a separate, independent layer.
Yeah, there is more or less a buffer there. And what this does is now they will report directly up the chain of command to the mayors. There's concern that there's concern that political influence might be exerted more directly on them, and and it can cut both ways. Or developers generally are pretty reliable donors to political campaigns, so that they might be able to exert influence on the one hand. And then you've also got neighborhood groups. I mean, Knoxville Planning Alliance, one of the co-founders got elected to county commission, so they try to exert influence themselves. At least some neighborhood groups do. So there is a concern that mayors, and maybe not Kincannon and Jacobs themselves, but future mayors as well, could put some pressure on these these dispassionate planners to do things one way or make decisions one way or another. Another thing that kind of came up that was interesting is the way that this kind of came out is that nobody really announced it. The Planning Commission has before their meeting, they have an agenda review meeting where they go through all the things that they're going to be talking about in the upcoming meetings, so they can hash out some of the technical details. And they were told then that this was going to be happening. And
right, the decision was kind of made by the two mayors without public discussion.
Right. Yes, it was made by the two mayors. No public discussion. They went down that, and then. In city council, one of the city council members had found out about it, and there was an item tucked into a much larger budget amendment ordinance that had a little extra money for the mayor's office to fund a special assistant to help create a department of planning. And there's
zoning, isn't it?
I'm sorry,
They're calling it a zoning department.
They call it the zoning department, but the council members were basically blindsided by that, and so there was some complaining about that, and understandably so. I mean, it was one of those things where there was apparently either no or very little communication between the city administration and the city council, and that didn't go over real well. And they may discuss it again next week too, so we'll see.
And there's going to be still some planning staff under the planning director, right, that will handle sort of bigger picture issues.
Yeah. What this is, these are the planning staff that are going to be moved are the people who deal with these zonings and the nuts and bolts planning stuff. Planning Commission does a lot more than that. They do IT. They do the computer mapping for the county. They staff the transportation planning organization. They do a lot more, and that part of the staff is going to stay, and they're still going to be there. It's just when a developer asks for a rezoning of a property, instead of going to the Planning Commission staff, he goes to the either city or county staff, depending on the jurisdiction.
But for now, anyway, nobody's talking about changing the Planning Commission itself, right? Because right now we have a 15-member Planning Commission where 8 members are appointed by the county mayor and 7 members by the city mayor, but they vote, all 15 of them vote on everything that comes before them, and that is staying the same for now, right?
That's staying the same. Everybody's insisting that is going to stay the same. It would require state action to change that. They would have to separate that, because this is considered a regional planning commission by the state of Tennessee. So it could happen down the road, but they're insisting it's not. In fact, this division of the staff isn't really going to be completed until next fiscal year. So it's going to be a transition time.
Well, one thing that I think is interesting about this is that when the Metropolitan Planning Commission, as it used to be called, was created in the 1950s, I think there was a general sense among civic leaders at the time that this was a step toward what would eventually be what I think people kind of envisioned as likely a move toward metro government, that the city was going to continue growing out into the unincorporated county areas, and that eventually it would all, and of course there have been efforts to create a metro government in Knox County, which have failed every time it's been brought up for a public vote. The last one was in the 1990s. And so I just think it's interesting now to see, what are we, almost 70 years after this joint planning body was created, instead of it being the first step toward metro government, now we don't have metro government 70 years later, and actually the city and the county are splitting up some of those functions, which, I feel like that metro government question is one that comes up a lot at public forums and things. People ask, do you think we'll ever have a metro government? And I have to say that has seemed sort of increasingly less likely over recent decades as the city and county have sort of taken different paths on lots of fronts. And this, to me, seems like one more sort of acknowledgement that, the city and the county are going to stay very separate entities for the foreseeable future.
Oh, absolutely. I think that, I think that metro government's been pretty much dead for a while, and this is just an acknowledgement of that. Perhaps I think you could consider it that anyway. Because the city and the county have different zoning codes, you'll have one staff that's dedicated to just following it, and then another staff that's dedicated to following the county code, and I can see that where there might be value in that, and that it kind of makes sense. And it makes sense to the mayors. So it is strange that there wasn't any kind of joint announcement or anything that they were going to be doing this. They don't need permission to do it.
Right. But there's still been no press release or anything.
No.
You wrote about this in Compass, and I think that's basically the only public discussion of it there's been, apart from at these couple of meetings where it's come up.
Right. I mean, when Jeff Welch, the executive director of Knoxville-Knox County Planning staff, brought it up at the Planning Commission's agenda review meeting, that's a meeting that very few people will actually cover. I cover Planning Commission, and if I've got a conflict, I don't cover that. I'll catch up with it later. Of course, 2 days afterwards, there's the actual Planning Commission meeting where they actually make decisions, and so that's the most important meeting to cover. And then the City Council meeting the other night, you would you would really, it wasn't anything that jumped out. I mean, even within the agenda item, it was a part of a $7.5 million budget amendment that included $5 million for repairs to the public safety center,
right,
and things like that. I mean, there were other big ticket items that were that got your attention, and this one actually didn't get much attention at all.
right. Well, I guess as with so many things, we will just continue. We'll
keep paying attention to it, and there should be a lot more. I mean, one of the things that with the county side, they're going to do it different from the way the city is. They're just going to basically fold it into the engineering and public works department, and the city is going to create the zoning department that we talked about, which means creating a whole new city department. They have to go through. They have to add these positions to civil service. They have to do a lot of things that the county isn't really going to be doing. So, as I said before, the changes won't be really complete until the next fiscal year once the budget process. And it will require some. It's not going to cost any more money really. What it means is the city and the county will be paying less to the planning commission staff, and then they'll have more on their staffing. So
right, they'll kind of shift money
shifting money around. It's not really going to cost anymore.
Right. Okay. Well, as we mentioned, we do have elections coming up. November 8th is election day. Early voting starts this coming Wednesday, October 19th. We have been writing articles, candidate profiles about the contested races. And we still have a couple more articles to get in, which will be coming in this coming week, leading up to early voting starting. But we have written about a good number of them already, and you can find that coverage at CompassKnox.com. And before we get to early voting starting this coming week, we are going to move all of that coverage, as we usually do before elections, outside our paywall. So even if you are not a Compass subscriber, you will be able to read those there. Or if you are a subscriber, you can share them with anybody you want. Tell them about the work that we do at Compass. And I thought that maybe we could talk just about a couple of these, several of these races, while even the ones that have that are competitive, that have multiple candidates on the ballot, don't really look that competitive if you kind of look at the makeup of the districts. But there's a couple that are interesting. One I wanted to mention is District 90, which is a new district, essentially. It's new to Knox County. It was created in the state's redistricting process this past year. And of course, what they did, and I think we've talked about this on the podcast already, was they redrew the old District 13, essentially eliminated the old District 13. There is now another District 13 somewhere else in the state. They moved it somewhere, which was the district represented by State Representative Gloria Johnson, who is one of two Democrats in the Knox County delegation, and is sort of one of the least popular Democrats among the House Republican leadership, I think it's fair to say. She is very outspoken. She has a strong and persistent presence on social media, often calling out the Republican supermajority for what she sees as, bad behavior or things she thinks they're not being honest about. She will kind of get in their face a little bit. And what they did was, first of all, they eliminated her district completely, and then in creating this new District 90, they drew it in such a way, it just so happened that her house, her residence, was cut out. And was moved over into State Representative Sam McKenzie's District 15. He's the other
Democrat, yeah.
And so they put her, there was only one other Democrat in Knox County. They managed to put Gloria Johnson in his district, which of course she wasn't going to run against McKenzie. And so she went ahead and moved. She had to move about a mile into another North Knoxville neighborhood to be in this new District 90. And there's a Republican, David Posey Paskabut. I don't actually know how to say his last name, partly because he did not agree to do an interview with us. Most candidates, Democrats and Republicans, have agreed to talk to us this cycle, and we appreciate that. We always extend that invitation. And of course, we just want to talk to people, find out who they are, what they stand for, and so forth. And one question that I would have asked him was, how exactly do you say his last name? But apparently that's a bit of an issue for him because he goes by Posey. It's not his legal last name, but all of his campaign materials just say Posey on it, and on the ballot it has Posey in quotation marks.
It's a nickname,
You can put a nickname on the ballot because they want people to be able to run as the name they're best known by. Every time before that I've seen a nickname, it's been for the first name. I don't think I've ever seen a nickname for a last name before. But in any case, Mr. Posey, as we'll call him, is the Republican candidate running in this district. I think one thing that's interesting is that in redrawing the district and in drawing Johnson out of it, the Republican majority did not really make this district much more Republican. It looks like it's still going to be, like if you just look at the areas that were added to it, which are some parts of West Knoxville, essentially, they are still mostly Democratic-leaning areas, like West Hills, for example, which I guess just kind of shows that there's only, so many ways you can draw these lines. And in a county like Knox County, where 45% of the population voted for Joe Biden in 2020, there's just too many Democrats to try to squeeze them all into one state legislative district, right?
Yeah, and they didn't do what they did in Nashville, where they basically looked at Nashville and really split it up. But anyway, the district does appear to be generally a Democratic leaning district. The West Knoxville precincts you talked about that were taken out were actually in the 18th district, which might end up being a little more Republican. We'll talk about that in a minute, or I guess I'll go ahead and talk about it now. That's a race.
That's the other maybe interesting local
it's the other.
race.
It is the other. It is really interesting. The 18th district is represented now by Eddie Manis, Republican, fairly moderate Republican. A lot of Republicans didn't like his stances on some social issues. He was accused of being a rhino.
But it's worth mentioning he was the first and only openly gay Republican state legislator in Tennessee history.
Yeah, and so he decided not to run for re-election, which left the seat open. Elaine Davis won the Republican primary. She has kind of an interesting background because she was originally a Democrat, switched parties in 2008 for the election there, and since has become a leader in the Republican Party. She's been the vice chair of the party, and she's run for office several times, has never won.
She actually ran against Gloria Johnson last time around.
Yes, she ran against
in a totally different district.
Yes, when they did the redistricting, she was taken out of the 13th, well, now 90th district, and put into the 18th. Anyway, she's tried several times. She's not been successful the entire time. She won the primary, so that was one election that she won. She's running against Gregory Kaplan, who's a University of Tennessee Spanish professor. First time he's running for office, and he was kind of spurred on to run by the Divisive Concepts Bill, which we've talked about on the program, and he thinks that the Republican supermajority has been too extreme, and he's trying to paint himself as the reasonable alternative and a more moderate alternative to some of the Republicans, especially his opponent. He thinks that she's fairly extreme. One of the interesting things about that district is in 2020, when Manis was elected, he won by about 9.5% of the vote. And that was the smallest margin of any of the seats that went to Republicans in that election. And so there was some thought that, that it could be at least close, and the Democrats would have a chance at flipping that district. And one of the interesting dynamics there is, we mentioned that it could end up being a little bit more Republican, but we've also had the Dobbs decision, where there is now the state's trigger law is in effect and the abortion ban is in effect, and really we don't know how that's going to affect turnout and how it's going to affect voters there. In some places across the country, so far, some suburban voters have switched, and we don't know what the impact is going to be there. But if there is an impact, it probably will be visible in the outcome in that race.
And Kaplan has said he's opposed to the state's abortion ban. At a minimum, he thinks there should be exceptions, and really he thinks the ban itself should be overturned. But Elaine Davis has said she doesn't even, and there have been some Republicans running this year who've said they're open to talking about some exceptions to this law, but she is saying she doesn't even want any exceptions. She
doesn't want any exceptions. She tries to characterize, and we've talked about this, the ban before. She tries to characterize the affirmative defense provision of the bill as an exemption. It doesn't actually exempt anything. What it does is it allows any medical provider who is charged with a felony, when they go to court, if they can prove that they performed the abortion to save the life of the patient, then they can use that as a valid defense.
Right, but it's not actually an exception.
It's not actually an exception. It doesn't prevent them from being charged with a crime.
Yeah.
And so.
Well, and that district is interesting because in winning that primary, Davis beat City Councilwoman Janet Testerman, who was kind of running a little bit more in the Manus mold, kind of like, old school West Knoxville establishment Republican. And she lost. She won a lot of those West Knoxville traditionally Republican districts. She lost heavily in the South Knox parts of the district. But you kind of wonder, people who voted, especially in those West Knoxville precincts, who voted for Testerman, obviously didn't want to vote for Davis at that point. Will they now come around and vote for Davis in the general? Or will some of them either stay home or cross over and support Kaplan, who's presenting himself as this, well-educated, obviously. And that is those areas of West Knoxville, those are made up of very affluent, well-educated households. So, it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, when one thing Kaplan is very, seems to be pretty intentional about trying to stake out that middle ground, because he talks about wanting to continue a Manus-style representation of the district, very reasonable and more moderate approach. He is, as just about everybody who's been involved with politics has done, he's talked to Victor Ashe about certain issues, and Ashe has become kind of the elder statesman of local politics. Almost everybody in either party goes to talk to him, but he, of course, is firmly a member of that traditional West Knoxville
the kind of moderate Republican.
Right. And so it'll be interesting to see, how Kaplan has received some donations from people who tend to give to Republicans. So it'll be interesting to see if he will be able to snag those more traditional moderate Republicans, and really with traditional moderate Republicans, and if there's a surge or a shift toward Democrats because of the abortion decision, could be enough to actually either at least make it really close, or he could even pull one out and flip the district.
We're certainly not making any predictions here.
No,
but we will be interested to see how that plays out. And of course, there are contested races in several other legislative districts, and you can read about those in our coverage. We're not going to really talk about them here because most of them are districts where there is such a strong partisan lean that I guess if any of them change hands, then we'll come back and talk about it because it'll be really interesting.
That'll be big news.
Yeah.
Big news.
But we do want to hit on, also on the ballot, there are four proposed state constitutional amendments that we want to run through kind of quickly here, but they're all worth talking about a little bit. We have written about amendment number 1, which I think is the one that's gotten the most attention and is maybe the most, really the only controversial of the four.
Yeah.
And you can find our coverage of that. That is already outside the paywall, actually. You can find it on our website. But this is the right to work amendment. And this would basically take, Tennessee has had a right to work law since 1947. And this would essentially take that existing state law and embed it in the state constitution. So if it passes, it won't change anything about current state law. This is already, it's been the law for 75 years. It will make it much harder for anybody in the future to try to change that law because, of course, once it's in the Constitution, if you want to change it, you need another constitutional amendment or statewide referendum to take it out or to rewrite it. And what this does, right to work laws basically impose some restrictions on unions. And the major restriction that they impose is that you can't have what is called a closed shop, which means that in this state, you can still have unionized workplaces, and we do have unionized workplaces in Tennessee. Not very many of them, only about 5 to 6% of Tennessee workers are in unionized workplaces. But you can still have, because of federal law, it guarantees you the right to organize a union in your workplace wherever you are. And the difference is that in a state like Tennessee with a right to work law, even if you have a unionized workplace, people who work there do not have to join the union. They cannot be compelled to pay union dues. And so unions don't like these laws because, first of all, it limits their membership. In a state that allows closed shops, basically, if you go to work at a union place, this was me in New York. I worked at the New York Times, which was a union shop. I had to be a member of the union in order to work there. Union dues came out of my well, I didn't actually have to be a member. I had to pay dues. It was up to me whether I wanted. Union dues came out of my paycheck, whether I wanted them to or not. And so, of course, that gives unions a lot more. First of all, it gives them financial support because that's what funds unions, is those union dues. But it also gives them a lot more leverage in talking with the bosses to say, we literally represent every person here. Now, here in Tennessee...
I worked at the News Sentinel, which is represented by the News Guild. And
you were the shop steward for
a
while, weren't you?
I was an officer for a while. I actually was also in management at the News Sentinel, so I was on both sides of it at various points. But you did not have to be join the union to get the union benefits. I mean, and that's one of the reasons that it's not real popular among union folk is. The unions go out there and they spend money and they go into negotiations with management, and they get, typically get better wages than other people in the same industry and that are in non-union shops, and they get some job protections and they get those things, but they apply to everybody, and somebody isn't a union member gets those benefits as well, and it does bug some union members.
Sure.
When they kind of look at people who are in the workplace who don't contribute to their dues to the union and aren't union members, kind of look at them as freeloaders.
Well, and I covered a union rally last month of local union members opposed to this amendment, and they gave actual examples that some of them have dealt with, where they have somebody who worked there who was not a member and didn't pay dues, but then got fired and wanted to contest the firing, and the union still was obliged to provide, legal assistance, contest their case for them and everything, even though they weren't a member. So, unions see these as free riders, essentially. And, it's interesting that this, one of the arguments against this amendment is, well, why do we need it? The state has had a right to work law for 75 years. We have a Republican supermajority in the legislature that clearly is not going to change that anytime in the near future. But this was pushed by basically major corporate interests. The State Chamber of Commerce is in favor of it. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, a very anti-union organization, has supported it. And this was interestingly in the works because we've talked about before, the process, it takes several years to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot because it has to be approved in separate sessions of the state legislature. So work on this actually began in 2018 and 19, well before what we are seeing now, which is a surge of labor activity across the country. I think there was a 6-month period in the early part of 2022 that saw the largest jump in new union organizing efforts in decades in this country. Coming out of the pandemic, there's been talk about this, and a lot of this is happening at places like Starbucks, Amazon. We've heard about these efforts around the country. We actually have 2 unionized Starbucks in Knox County now. But all of that, the work on this amendment started before all that happened, but I think the fact that we've seen a surge of that activity has increased focus on this amendment, both from people who want the amendment, who are saying, see, we need this because we've got unions coming in, more aggressively now, and we need to, as they say, protect our workers from being forced to join a union. On the other side, the sort of heightened level of union activity and attention to labor organizing, I think, has also carried over to the discussion around this amendment. And so both on the pro and con side, I think that recent events have kind of propelled that. Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, you talked about, Starbucks. These are a lot of these companies are companies you don't think of as being unionized companies. I mean, these aren't Teamsters. They're not, they're not truck drivers, not factory workers, and then you get the stereotype of the union thug anyway, and you think about baristas breaking kneecaps. I don't see that happening. But
right. Well, and it is one of the things I think everybody agrees that led to the long-term erosion of unionization in the workforce, which reached its peak in the 50s with about 35% of the workforce, has been the shift from manufacturing and heavy industrial work to the service economy. And service workers traditionally have been much harder to organize than industrial workers for lots of different reasons. But that is where we're seeing these efforts now, is in those service sectors. Although the Amazon work, the efforts to organize warehouses, that is sort of the more traditional.
That's a little more blue collar than
but anyway, that's Amendment 1. The other 3 amendments do not really seem to have a lot of controversy around them.
No, Amendment number 2 would establish a succession plan in case the governor is incapacitated. We are actually the only state that doesn't have this. And what it would do is it would establish that the lieutenant governor or the Speaker of the Senate, who is Knox and Anderson County's Randy McNally at this point, would, if the governor were incapacitated in any way, would be able to serve as governor. If there's for some reason, no Speaker of the Senate, then the Speaker of the House would do that. It's really not controversial because it makes, it sounds kind of logical, and the state didn't have anything like that. So if, a governor went into surgery and was out for a while or injured.
Or ended up in a coma
something like that. There was no,
because we do have a succession plan if the governor dies,
but not if the governor is incapacitated. So that's Amendment 2. I don't see that as being controversial at all. Amendment 3 is unusual because technically under the state constitution, slavery is still legal in one form, and that is if you are convicted of a crime. Now this goes back to the Jim Crow era in Tennessee's long and violent history of it, what the amendment would do, of course, would be eliminate that and say that slavery is gone.
And in fact, I don't think because of civil rights laws and everything else, I don't think, just because it's in the Constitution.
Yeah, it's been ignored for a long time.
Right. I don't think we could have slavery.
It wasn't. I mean, Tennessee's got a history from around the turn of the century when the state would basically contract out prisoners who were mostly African Americans.
The old convict leasing program.
Right, to companies like mining companies and other extractive industries. And they did that. And speaking of labor, the non-prisoner coal miners, especially here, didn't take kindly to that, and there was actually the Coal Creek War.
The Coal Creek War, one of the most fascinating, I think, incidents in East Tennessee history, and anybody who doesn't know it should look it up because it's quite a story.
Yeah, when I write about it, I'm going to mention that, of course. It's a fascinating history, but it was a very violent time in our country and in our state, and since that time, basically, prison slave labor has rightly been. Although one thing is now, and this is a provision that's in the amendment, says prison labor can still be used. You just have to pay them.
Right.
That's the key. So not all, it won't mark the end of prison labor. What it does is just say that, basically you have to get paid
it can't be compulsory.
It can't be compulsory.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do think there was another step in there that happened because the convict leasing system was eventually eliminated after the Coal Creek War and some other disputes. But because this measure was still in the Constitution, what the state said in the early 20th century was, okay, fine, we'll do it ourselves. We won't lease them because that's what was prohibited at the time. But I don't know how many people know that we have Brushy Mountain Prison here, of course, and not too far from Knoxville over in Wartburg. Brushy Mountain Prison was built literally as a state-owned slave mine because the state could still use convicts as slave labor, and they built Brushy Creek on top of a coal seam. And the whole idea of that, first of all, the prisoners had to build the prison themselves. So they used convict labor to build the prison that then they held the prisoners in to work in the mine that was attached to the prison. They were not paid for this at all. It was literally a state-owned slave mine, and this persisted into the 1950s or so. I'm not sure exactly when that mining operation ended, but we did have actual slavery state-operated slavery going on here well into the 20th century. So that's Amendment 3. That would get rid of that reference to slavery.
Yeah, it gets rid of the reference altogether. The Amendment 4 is even less controversial, if it can be. There's language in the state constitution now that prohibits clergy from serving in the legislature, and it is one that has been ignored. In fact, there are at least 2 clergy members who are serving the legislature now. And
there was I think a U.S. Supreme Court decision in the 70s
that
said you can't restrict this, so it hasn't had any legal force for decades.
This is basically what they like to call a housekeeping measure. It's just going to take that out of the Constitution if it passes. And like, as we said, none of these 3 are very controversial. There's only one way that I see them as not passing, and that is if people don't vote in them, because the process is, first of all, to go into effect, to become part of the Constitution, it needs a majority of yes votes. Everybody understands that. But that number of yes votes has to be at least 50% plus 1 of the votes for governor. So if you vote for governor, and then you decide to skip the amendments, because either you don't want to read through them, and they're long. They're a couple of pages on the ballot, so and you just skip those, then there is a chance that they wouldn't pass if enough people skipped.
Because if there's 3 million votes in the governor's race and only 2 million votes in the amendments race, and only 1 million or 1.5 million of those are for, like, you might not have enough votes even if 80% of the votes on the amendment are in favor of it.
Right. So you still need to. So in order for if you want to pass these amendments, make sure you vote for them, because if you don't, then that's if you don't vote for them, it's a vote against them.
Right.
Essentially.
Yep. Well, and I think another thing just to reinforce about all 4 of these amendments is that whether they pass or not, none of them are going to actually change much of anything about day-to-day life in Tennessee, because the right to work, we already have a right to work law, so that's not going to change anything whether it passes or not. Now, the gubernatorial succession one, again, that only matters in this extremely rare, and so far I don't think we've ever had it happen, where a governor was incapacitated to the degree where somebody else had to serve for them. And then the slavery prohibition and the one on pastors already don't really have any legal force. So none of these are really going to change anything, but they clean up some things in the Constitution, and in the case of Amendment number 1, they embed something in the Constitution that is currently only in state code.
Yep.
So that is the story on those amendments. Again, early voting starts on Wednesday, October 19th. And you can find information about the ballot and early voting locations and times at knoxvotes.org, which will take you to the Knox County Election Commission. All right, now it is time for our weekly interview segment. We thought, given some things that seem to be shifting in the economy a little bit, and the fact that we're having interest rates go up at a really kind of unprecedented rate, that'd be a good time to check in on our local housing market, which of course has been the topic of great discussion here locally and across the country the last couple of years. And so we talked to Hancen Sale with the Knoxville Area Association of Realtors, and let's go ahead and go to that tape. Our guest this week on the podcast is Hancen Sale, who is the Legislative and Government Affairs Director for the Knoxville Area Association of Realtors. Hancen, thanks a lot for being with us.
Excited to be here.
So housing has been a major focus of local conversation here really for several years. Issues of affordability, of inventory. We all know that there has been a real run-up in prices locally and nationally, sort of coming out of the pandemic. But we wanted to start off by talking about where we are now, because it seems like we're maybe seeing some shifts in the economy. Obviously, interest rates have been rising now for several months, driven by the Fed. What are you seeing? What are your realtors seeing on the ground in terms of how that's affecting the behavior of either buyers or sellers?
Yeah, well, it's had a substantial impact already, and you hear that when you talk to realtors, but also just looking at the data. So, interest rates have more than doubled in a really short period of time. There's only one other instance in history when mortgage rates have risen so fast, so quickly, and by this much. So it has had a monumental impact to the extent that, the average payment for a new listing, monthly payment, is almost $800 more expensive than it was just, at the start of this year. And so what we've seen is that buyers have really pulled back. Supply has not been as impacted. You've seen that demand is what has been waning. And that's part of what has contributed to, we're seeing more listings on the market They're up about 50% year over year, although still below pre-pandemic levels. But it's starting to level off. So we're not seeing that it's skyrocketing. It's elevated because buyers are starting to pull back. And secondly, sellers are pulling back. One of the biggest drivers of keeping inventory relatively low at the moment is that people are not listing their homes, in part because a lot of people are locked in with fairly low mortgage rates, and the prospect of selling and trading up to a nicer house with a much higher interest rate isn't all that attractive. So it hasn't had that's been good for the stability of things, but we're definitely seeing things slow down in a pretty substantial way.
And are you seeing any impact on the price side yet? I mean, I'm just guessing that as buyers are looking at paying those higher interest rates, which, as you say, drives the monthly payment along with the actual purchase price of the property, is that having any impact on what sellers think they can get, or are people still listing at these fairly elevated prices that we've been seeing?
Well, that's a good question. So we talk a lot about price cuts. So anytime the market starts to change in any way, price cuts become more prevalent, because otherwise you would just continue the trend. And the trend for the last 2 years has been more than 20% price increases every year. So we're starting to see some price cuts of people who are pricing at the top of the market, and we're not at the top of the market anymore. And so buyers are pushing back on the cream of the top price echelon, but we're still seeing pretty robust demand, and we're still a fair majority, a large majority actually, of homes are still selling at or above list price, which is not typical, at least in years past. And so we're still seeing that the prices are growing, but it's just not as quickly as it was. We're starting to see that moderate and level off, which is ultimately probably a good thing for the long run stability of the market. But we certainly haven't seen any nominal price declines at this point. We're just starting to see things level off.
Yeah, Hancen, one of the interesting things that you guys put out a great monthly newsletter, by the way, on the housing market. In the last one, you all noted that the income level needed to buy a median priced house in Knox County or the Knoxville area was about $72,500. But the median income in Knox County is around $59,000. And in other counties in the Knoxville area, it's lower. So my question is, what are builders doing, or what can be done to kind of get those more in line? Because it looks like even if you have a median income, you can't afford a median price house.
Yeah, no, it's a really big problem. And I think that statistic too is factoring in a 20% down payment, which in this market is not typical. I mean, you look at the median or typical home buyer is not coming with 20% down. I mean, we've seen a large increase in these 5% down. So, the required income is even higher once you get past that. But, it's an interesting dynamic. I think the people who are, trying to get into home ownership, first time buyers are the ones who have been squeezed out. And you see that reflected in the data. Even in 2021, we saw that the number of young professionals buying homes plummeted. So that 25 to 32-ish age range, the demand and the number of applications they were submitting for mortgages just plummeted. So I think the people who are being squeezed out of the market are, the median price buyer. And, that's part of the impact of migration to East Tennessee, is that people who are coming from elsewhere in a higher cost metro who are selling their home and moving here have a significant advantage. And, at this point, I don't see that there's a lot of, there's no short-term answer to that from the builder's perspective. I mean, they're still selling. I think they're seeing a pretty huge slowdown with the way rates are going. But a first-time home buyer is not the typical new home buyer either. So I think people are staying in place. You're seeing that in the rental market and in the for sale market. People, the pullback has not been we're selling and forced to foreclose or anything like that. We're just not going to act because there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm going to stay in my rental unit or apartment, or I'm going to stay in my home and wait and see what happens.
Well, and you mentioned rentals, which I think, is it about 50% of residents in Knox County are rental versus owners?
Yeah, a little under 50.
And obviously there's been a lot of pressure in the rental market too, and we've seen rents going up. So is what's going on right now going to just squeeze that even more? I mean, if people are kind of staying in place and houses aren't opening up for people to move out of rental into places that they're going to buy, is that just like, is there any relief from any of this in the rental market, or is all of this just going to continue to push rents up?
Well, the good thing, there is some good news in the sense that, occupancy is high, which doesn't bode well for rents, but this higher interest rate environment, the proliferating rents, has sort of paused household formation in some instances. So people choosing to move away from home and get their own place, or roommates deciding to get their own place, that seems to sort of have paused, which will lessen some demand on that side. But on the rental side, I mean, there's two really positive trends working in the rental market. And one is that you see at the bottom end of the market is where rent growth has basically been flat. You see that most of the rent increases, when you get into the 20 to 30% year over year increases, that's almost exclusively at the top end of the market. So disproportionately people who can afford, a class A unit and who can actually have the income to afford those increases. Whereas at the bottom end, more affordable end of the market, they just haven't seen, it's really been pretty average what we see on the price growth and rent growth there. And then secondly, what happened in the pandemic was it did provoke us to start a lot of new units. And so we're building, units under construction is at one of the highest levels in Knoxville's history. And so those are going to keep hitting the market. And, I do think we're going to see occupancy start to fall, which is a good thing. I mean, we're at sitting around 98% right now, and what is considered healthy is 94, 95. And, we haven't been there in 5 years. So I think that is a positive trend, that we're building more than we ever have. And that could also bode well in sort of creating some, easing the pressure in the rental market.
Yeah, one of the theories you hear bandied about is that it really doesn't matter what the price point is on housing, whether it's rental or household owned housing, but it really doesn't matter that you can build on the high end, but that makes the lower end more affordable. And so it's really the total number of units rather than the specific price points over time. Is there some validity to that idea that even though you build more high end units, it ends up being people move into those high end units from lower end units, and that frees up that supply?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to characterize it. I mean, when you expand the housing stock, you are creating more housing, and it is lessening demand across the board. So that's certainly a factor that is working. Any housing is good housing. At this point, we just need more housing. It doesn't matter what it looks like. However, the caveat to that that I would add is that size matters. I mean, if you're only building 3-bedroom apartments, that's never really going to get to the level of affordability that a single young professional or a single baby boomer can afford or even desires. So, I mean, it does matter to the extent of, what's the size of the units that we're building. But, the idea that building luxury units is going to hurt anything, it's expanding the housing supply. And that's fundamentally the problem. Like you said, people move up and graduate to a nicer unit, and that frees up space for somebody else who might move up from another lower end unit and frees up a whole nother low end. So it's a chain effect, but certainly the nature of what we're building still matters. I mean, we need to have a variety of choices as far as layouts and units and such.
Well,
sorry.
Go ahead, Pat.
To that point, one thing that I don't have any data to back it up. It appears that things like 2-bedroom houses don't get built anymore. And so those are the types of houses that could, have a lower entry level for home ownership as far as the price goes and things like that. Are there public policies in place that are kind of preventing that kind of thing, or is that just a market-driven phenomenon?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, the rise in material costs and labor since the Great Recession just incentivizes you to build nicer products. But that being said, I mean, I think part of the conversation with the county's Advanced Knox Comprehensive Plan Initiative is that, essentially we require, our zoning code is written in a way that incentivizes you to build the biggest possible house on a particular lot. It doesn't incentivize you to build small. I mean, the larger lot size you require, the larger you're going, that's more land costs, and the larger home you're going to need to build to make the numbers work. And so, I think that's certainly part of it, but I also think there's sort of a misnomer that the first-time home buyer is necessarily the primary audience for new construction. There's really only been like one instance in American history when we were building new construction at a, affordable. That was new construction was an entry point housing, and that's more in the 70s. It's just really never been the case, but it has created this systemic problem where we don't have smaller housing. And I think like an important part of this is young professionals who Knoxville has struggled to recruit. They're one person. Do they need a 2-3 bedroom house with a yard? And conversely, baby boomers, who are one of the biggest segments of the market, are also this group that is one of the fastest growing sole person household generations. So baby boomers are living by themselves, and do they need a 2-3 bedroom house? And that is part of what we don't have in Knoxville, in part because of outdated zoning codes, and plans. We haven't enabled that. We haven't made it easy to build smaller units. And I think that's a huge part of why this is being, talked about right now, and why the county is deciding to undertake this really monumental process. Is because we don't have the variety. I mean, that's one of the biggest affordability challenges. We focus on the median sale price, but I think, personally, one of the most important aspects of the affordability conversation is choice. Can you even find a house that is small enough to really be affordable and desirable to a particular demographic?
Well, and one thing that I was struck by in one of your presentations to County Commission was talking about the difference between new units being built in Knox County and in Davidson County, Nashville. And of course, they've had a tremendous amount built. But you made the point that almost the entire difference between those two can be accounted for by multi-unit developments in Nashville. So it's not that they're building more single family homes and subdivisions. They're building more apartments and more condos, which means density. We talked with Jim Snowden, the county's engineering director, about density a little bit when we talked to him last week about the Advanced Knox process. And I guess, can you just talk a little bit about the role of density and multifamily housing as we look to meet the needs both within the city of Knoxville, where it's hard to build anything but multifamily really right now, and outside the city as well. And is that something that people are like, if we want to have enough housing to accommodate the growth that we're expecting, is that something people are going to have to get more comfortable with?
I think that's a really important part of it. And I even pulled the data for not just Davidson County and looked at a lot of our peer counties in Tennessee. And we're under building relative to our population to Chattanooga. I think every peer city except for Memphis, if I remember correctly. So in most of it is multifamily. We have done a particularly bad job of building multifamily. And that's part of why we're in this, occupancy crunch right now. We haven't built multifamily for, 2 decades. And it's something that we're going to have to grapple with, particularly if we want to remain a low tax environment. Multifamily development, just from a property tax perspective, is very lucrative for municipal and county budgets. You look at I like to think about it in the terms of like property tax per acre. How do you maximize the number of property tax dollars that you get per acre? And when you start to look at where we do get the highest amount of money per acre, it's all in the city, because we don't allow density by and large in the county. And if the county wants to continue to provide the services that we have, if we want to continue to invest in infrastructure and recreation, and keep our taxes low, we're going to have to build more multifamily housing. What that looks like is another question. It doesn't have to be look like an office park and be an apartment complex. It can be more mixed use, but that is one of the most critical parts of Advanced Knox, in my opinion, is creating these new communities and bolstering what communities already exist. You think about a lot of places like, if you live in DC, if you're from DC, you don't tell people that you live in DC. You say, I live in Alexandria, or over here. There's communities that have created, dense mixed use town centers that are an extension of your downtown in the city core. And so I think that's a big part of the Advanced Knox initiative. And I think multifamily, we're not accommodating the amount of housing that we need. And it's part because we haven't built multifamily. And just to piggyback one last thing on that, what's really fascinating is when you look at the valuation. So how much are the price point at which we're delivering multifamily, it costs us more to build a multifamily unit in Knoxville than it does in Nashville per unit, despite their, exceeding our production by, 3 times. I mean, they're building 3 times what we are, but they're delivering it at a lower price point from a building perspective. So it's very interesting, from a affordability perspective, from a sustainability of county financial budget perspective. I mean, it is really one of the keys that we kind of we're going to have to grapple with. It's not easy, and some people don't like it, but it's about what's best for the county. I think there's a strong argument to be made that we need more multifamily.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. For anybody who's watching the video of this, I just want to introduce, this is Barton the cat, who's joined us for part of the conversation. If you're not watching the video, you can go to the YouTube channel if you want to say hi to Barton. And before we go, Hancen, Scott mentioned the newsletter you put out. If people are interested in receiving that, how do they sign up?
You can go to www.kaarmls.com/market pulse. It's a monthly newsletter, a rundown of all of the housing stats and musings about the housing market that cross my brain every month, and you will get it to your inbox every month. And
it's free, right?
Completely free.
Yeah. It's a good resource. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you joining us.
Of course, glad to be here.
Thanks, Hancen.
All right, and thanks again to Hancen for talking with us. And again, if you are listening to us and not watching the YouTube and you want some cat content, you can go back and find the video on YouTube. All right, looking ahead to next week, sort of civic life resumes a bit coming out of the fall break. Monday, County Commission will be holding its monthly work session ahead of its voting meeting on October 24th. Various sort of interesting things on the agenda. One thing that kind of jumped out at me is Commissioner Kyle Ward has a resolution that would basically, if Commission approves it, would request the state to look at establishing a new mental health hospital to serve Knoxville and the surrounding region, kind of making the argument that after the old Lakeshore Mental Health Institute closed, the state made promises about providing resources that would make up for that loss, and saying that those haven't really been forthcoming. The state has argued that no, in fact, they do provide resources. It's just that it's through local private institutions. But anyway, a lot of talk about mental health here in recent years. And so that could be interesting. That meeting is at 5 o'clock in the main assembly room of the City County building. And of course, if you can't get there in person, you can watch it at Knoxville Community Media. And then the next day,
we got City Council, and Tuesday is going to be South Knoxville Investment Day with City Council, pretty much. We've got half a dozen items on the agenda that will represent $6.3 million of money that's going into South Knoxville. Everything's already been budgeted. It's not anything new that is coming up, but the contracts are going to be letting out. The biggest is about $2.7 million for the next phase of the Gateway Park for the urban wilderness. They're putting in pavilions and paving and doing restrooms and things like that. So that's a big step. They're also in that same area. There's a sidewalk project that's going to be getting about it's right-of-way acquisition, $575,000 for that. Then we go down to the South Waterfront, and Waterfront Drive, which is the new street that is along Suttree Landing Park there, and then the streets that connect to it. They're going to get, of course, new resurfacing. There's going to get sidewalks, get drainage things. That's going to be about $1.1 million. And then also along Sevier Avenue, there are going to be 3 contracts let out with AT&T, Comcast, and KUB for them to put utilities underground as part of the Streetscapes project. So a lot of money going into South Knoxville in the next few months. A lot of construction will be going on down there. So, but City Council is going to be considering that. I don't see any reason why they would not approve all of those. And then, as we mentioned earlier, they may bring up discussion again about the new zoning department that the mayor wants to establish.
All right. And as we said earlier, early voting starts on Wednesday, October 19th. And once again, you can find information about that at knoxvotes.org. And we will be back next week to talk about all of those things. And I need to mention our show is produced by Lord Seth Barber here at Barbarian Productions. Theme music by William Wright. And we still don't have a good tagline. I asked last week for a new tagline, gotten no suggestions. Maybe we need to have a focus group or something.
Got nothing. Yeah. Help us out. Send us an idea.
Talk to you later. That's not a good one. No.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.